Hello everybody, this is ManuS and welcome to another Eternal Top Decks video series here on my channel. So one of my teammates once again won something, this time last weekend's ETS, with a decklist of mine, my latest Hooru Midrange list, and I haven't really gotten around to do a Hooru Midrange deck tech since Palace came out, which is a bit unfortunate, but we will fix this now, because Hooru got a bunch of nice new toys. And it's time to talk about them. So I decided instead of streaming again like yesterday, I'll do a deck tech tomorrow and probably try to pick up streaming again tomorrow. I want to try to manage streaming like 5 days a week or something around 5 p.m. German time. Get a bit more regularity in and also stream like Eternal and Magic. So keep an eye out for that. I'm trying myself at a schedule and some regularity. Who would have thought to see the day? But we're going there. Anyway, before we start with the deck tech, you know the drill. Hit the subscribe button, turn on the notification icon to not miss out on future content, and please consider whitelisting EternalTitans.com and YouTube on your adblock. That would really help us a lot. And now on to the deck. Alright, so this is the deck. It's nothing too special. Really, it's just Hooru Midrange, all the good Hooru cards, but there are a couple of things to talk about. So first of all, 2-drops, 8 2-drops. I think you want at least 8 2-drops. I could see a bit more than 8, like 10 for example, since the deck doesn't have that much early interaction. Like you don't have stuff like Torch and Shakedown and stuff like Stone Scar does. Your like cheap spells are cards like Finest Hour and Levitate, which don't really do anything on turn 1 and only work once you have a unit in play anyway. So Hojan is kind of the no-brainer. Every like proactive Justice deck, aggro or midrange, is usually gonna play 4 of these if the deck has enough ways to trigger the Renown, because the card is super powerful. The major downside of the card is that it has 1 toughness, which will occasionally get punished by Snowballs, Vara's Favors, and Highwaymen. The amount of Highwaymen and Favor is going up a bit, but the amount of Snowballs is going down, so that helps. Also, if you're facing someone that had a Fate draw that could have a Snowball, you can always just delay it till turn 3 and then use a Levitate or Finest Hour in response to them using a Snowball. And the upside is just too big. If you play this on turn 2, the opponent doesn't answer it, and on turn 3 you hit it with a Mirror Image or one of the 1-cost cards, the ramp and the life swing are just so massive that it puts you in a winning position. The other 2-drop of choice is Kothon. Alternative options mostly involve Duskraider, really. Not a big fan of Duskraider. First of all, it has 2 toughness, so it attacks and blocks very poorly these days. Basically, anything that is 2-2 fights really, really poorly, especially without evasion these days, since all the good turn 2 plays and onwards, aside from merchants, are 2-3s or 3-3s. So you need to kind of be a 2-3 or 3-2 yourself, at the very least, to have some sort of impact. And if you play Duskraider, you might not even be able to attack the next turn. And yeah, also Kothon has some really good utility here. The Endurance allows you sometimes to get a bit of pressure in while keeping the opponent from doing the same to you. The deck is all about racing, so that is a nice upside, but it's minor. The big deal is really the ultimate. The deck wants to get to 6 power anyway because of Palace. It gets to 6 power even on turn 5 a fair share of the time because of Hojan. And having a 2-drop that becomes really strong later, but is decent early on, is pretty good. It also blocks War Leader, which is far from irrelevant. So there are a couple of solid things. And if you actually face a dedicated aggro deck like Skycrack again, which is being played a bit more, I still don't think it's that great, but people are playing more like 2-1 1-drops again, then Kothon is exactly where you want to be, and Duskraider is exactly where you don't want to be. Also, I feel like the Berserk has a lot less value from Duskraider these days, between Korovyat Palace providing Berserk when it's good to kill the opponent faster, and otherwise it's just kind of like random and may be decent, or may just be completely irrelevant if you have to block, and also if you Berserk too early, your unit might not be able to block, and that could become a problem. And also, the deck isn't super aggressive, so a fair share of the time, random Berserk on some units won't even win you the game faster than if it just didn't have Berserk. So overall, I feel like Berserk is very hit or miss and just not worth running a random 2/2 in your deck. When you have a great alternative like Kothon, that is just a very powerful unit still, and people kind of thrown him by the wayside or overlooked him, and I think he's exactly what this type of like kind of good stuff, proactive mid-range deck wants and needs. Then Pacifier is not too surprising. I think most people would put that in a deck like this. Basically, our 3-drops are Pacifier and Enforcer, and Merchant is just, well, Merchant, something that you play on 3 if you have no other 3-drop, or that you play on 3 if you need one of the cards from the market in the foreseeable future. But otherwise you want to play one of these because they have good impact for their cost, which can't be said for Merchant. Also, I think Winter's Merchant is a clear winner here over Black Market and over Yen of Merchant. Yen of Merchant is just horrible. It's a 2/2, and I already mentioned how bad 2/2s are, and the fact that it has Aegis doesn't really matter too much. This deck is mostly built around evasion, and therefore is not very good at making sure that Yen of Merchant has any meaningful impact, basically. The Smuggler, the new one, is pretty nice. The problem is, though, that this deck really doesn't want the Black Market, because you want to increase the amount of Korovyat palaces you can have, and that requires a Merchant. While unlike a lot of the smugglers now, the new Hooru Smuggler is quite strong and noticeably better than most merchants. The upside of having virtually 7 palaces is big enough, I think, that Winter's Merchant beats out the Smuggler. Also the fact that, once again, Winter's Merchant is a flyer, which works much better in what the deck wants to do, since it doesn't have that much removal and kind of just wants to fly over a lot of things and just kind of kill their biggest things or Sandstorm Titan to keep them from winning races. And then attacking for 2 in the air is better than not attacking for 3 on the ground, really. The biggest innovation that I come up with basically is Poaching Drake. First of all, since the nerf, Sheltering Rider is pretty bad. I mean, the card only really started seeing play once it got buffed. The 5th toughness, pretty big deal, especially against cards like, say, Highwayman, that already like kind of break the Aegis, but then at least you have the 0/5 that can just block it, and they kind of look at each other, which is fine. Now you have this 0/4 that is completely useless. Also, one of the top decks is Stone Scar with Vara, which makes Sheltering Rider really embarrassing. There are cards like Favor and Snowballs and stuff that kind of just shut down Sheltering Rider for free. The deck is pretty proactive and really wants to be attacking. Like, for example, your 4-drop really wants to be attacking on turn 5, so you can play Sediti with its Onslaught. And all these things are things that Rider is fairly bad at, and I really hate the card right now and cannot recommend playing it. But we needed another 4-drop, even though we sometimes skip 4, thanks to Hojan. So Poaching Drake is a card that I always kind of liked and thought has potential, but never quite made the cut. And I think now, with the increase of power level of good 2 and 3 drops that people are playing, and even some 1 drops like Initiate, Poaching Drake's ability is going way up in value. Like, there's War Leader, Teacher, Stinger, Instigator, Champion of Chaos, Initiate of the Sands, the new Tokas, and so on and so forth. In the mirror there's Pacifier and Enforcer, or even the good 2-drops that we're looking at here. There's so many like high value units these days that are massively downgraded by turning them into a GOAT, and is very valuable of doing so to make sure to stay ahead on board and in the race. And also gives you ways to deal with problematic units without running a lot of removal, especially because the next best removal options in this deck, past Vanquish, are stuff like Permafrost and Ice Bolt. I think Ice Bolt is pretty bad. It's just too expensive for how much the downside is. If the card would cost 1, it would be good. It would be worse the downside, but I think for 2, if you don't have to, just don't run it. You really don't want to like ramp your opponent. And Permafrost is fine, but it's kind of hit or miss and can be punished. But it's something that I could see, since the downside that it has is in a way less bad than Ice Bolt, because it temporarily disables the unit for sure, and also it costs half the power, being a 1-cost card that you can kind of squeeze into a turn, like turn 4 play a 3-drop, and a Permafrost, for example, is vital and lines up well with Vanquish, which already is a 2-cost interaction. So adding more 2-cost interaction is kind of just making the curve and how stuff lines up more awkward. The fact that this has 3 toughness, dying to Torch is not that big of a deal anymore. Rizan is not much of a card anymore, which is one of the cards that could come to mind that punish it later, and Torch is already working overtime really between Hojan, Kothon and Enforcer, so they more often than not won't have a Torch for your Poaching Drake. And even if they do, it's not the end of the world if you, for example, turn the 5/5 Champion of Chaos into a 2/1 goat, for example. And also it's not like Torch on Shelterwing Rider is great for us either, so especially now that it has 4 toughness and doesn't really block that well anymore. Sediti is like the big new addition. I don't think we really need to say a whole lot here. First of all, the card is a 6/6 flyer for 5, which is amazing, which is arguably better than the 4/8 of a melee. Second of all, it has Warp, so it's occasionally just a free 5-cost 6/6 flying in terms of card economy. And then it has this super powerful Onslaught, if you get it off, that can just win games on its own, especially when you force the opponent on defense, or the opponent is just a control deck that's not very good at dealing damage to you, and you suddenly draw 2 cards a turn, which is insane. So yeah, this card is an utter powerhouse, and thanks to the Insignias that we got, a 2-faction deck like Hooru can fairly easily support this guy, and most of the time play him on turn 5, or even on turn 4 with Hojan, which is amazing. Then we have 3 Palace, not much explanation needed. 3 Finest Hour, there were 4 at some point, but the thing is, Finest Hour is not that great here. It's kind of situational. It's not the best way to trigger Hojan on turn 3 if you just kind of throw it away to gain some life and deal some damage and trigger his Renown. So drawing multiples can be awkward, so 3 seems like a fine number. We also have 4 Levitate to trigger Hojan and kind of just cycle. Then we have 4 Vanquish as removal, and 3 Mirror Image to go for the like Hojan into Mirror Image power draw, another way to trigger Renown. And otherwise we have such high card quality that Mirror Image is great more often than not. We have like Enforcer to get more silence, we have Poaching Drake to goat more stuff, or just copy a Sediti or copy a unit buffed by Palace with Withstand. There's a lot of good options. We can even go for like Svetya into Mirror Image out of the market. Then regarding the power base, we have 30 power total. I have 3 Seek power, basically as additional Primal sources. We have 16, 17 with 1 Sigil, and these, which puts us at 20 Primal, which is actually quite a lot, even for turn 4 Poaching Drake, so making Drake very consistent. Although if you have to get Primal Sigil to play Drake, that means you can't play Sediti the next turn, but that's a fine sacrifice to be able to play your cards and then just play Sediti on 6, for example. It also helps for Palace, obviously. I basically shaved 1 Seek power to be able to squeeze a couple of Crownwatch standards in, because they're just pretty good in a deck like this for racing, gaining life back. Also, it's an additional combat trick to help push through blockers, and even better late than never trigger a Hojan's Renown, stuff like that. It's just a good card to have access to, and I didn't want to go below like 9 Sigils because of Seed, and Seek helping a bit with this too. Plus 30 power seems like a good number if you have 5 drops and a bunch of 6 drops and a 6-cost ultimate, and Hojan and Levitate help with the power a bit. These 4 Hojans maybe being worth 1 to 2 power sources, and Levitate maybe like 1, like these together maybe are like worth 2 to 3 power sources. making this deck pretty comfortable at getting to 5 and 6 more often than not, and even allowing you to use Crownwatch standard as a spell more often than as a power, unless early in the game. The other option could be to do something like 25 plus like 4, or even like 26 plus 3, or 27 plus 2 or something, and then put a power in the market, like a banner in the market, because I think you don't want to like play 2 Crownwatch standard and like 25 power and Seeks. That's just gonna make your power really awkward. Also, like I said, you want sigils for your seed, so if you want to go to 29, I would cut a Seek power and then cut a banner for just a sigil probably, and put the banner in the market. The main thing is I kind of like all the market slots and not the biggest fan of power in the market unless necessary, but this is one of the decks where I can see it when your deck kind of sort of caps out at 5 and has a way to help with power like Hojan and Levitate, but still has 6 drops that it really wants to play on curve. And then having power in the market to both fix your Poaching Drake and Palace, and also just to get to Sediti and Palace on time when you have power issues, can be worthwhile. So maybe, I don't know, you could cut like reinforcements for it. I'll talk about the market now. So Vision of Austerity, just kind of your relic answer. There are a couple of things you might need to answer. Obelisk out of token decks, like Praxis tokens or Auralian relics. There is Martyr Chains decks. There's a couple of things that you might need to deal with occasionally, and it's important to have an answer to not lose to these cards. And the biggest thing that actually comes to mind is Sandstorm Scarf, because decks that just have Sandstorm Scarf to ground your flyers can cause serious trouble, because obviously due to having flying, your units are smaller than ground units, and then if they are grounded, you might just have a hard time pushing through. And having Vision of Austerity to hit that Sandstorm Scarf makes sure they have to play your game, and that's what we want, and then we're usually winning. And we have Pristine Light instead of the Force Vanquish in the market, simply because it's a more powerful effect. Sure, it's one power more expensive, and it can kill a Poaching Drake or Sediti sometimes, but I think the upside is like big enough that it's worthwhile, especially because you can usually attack and then Pristine Light. So you still get to draw the cards that you kill on your own side, and hitting 2 or 3 cards with this on the opposing side is really powerful. So I kind of like that option in the market, being like a pseudo harsh rule that is much cheaper and hits everything that matters, and even spare some of your stuff. Then we have Svetya. This used to be Shelterwing Rider, not 100% sure what is better. Tobbo made that change and said he liked Svetya a bit more. He didn't really need either, but he at least had situations where he could see himself getting Svetya while he never wanted to get Rider, so that seems fair. Another thing that I like about it is that you can, for example, go Svetya and then use mirror images to keep copying her, or you can just use her to break a Face Aegis on 4 and then set up a Sediti Onslaught Curse on 5, because the deck doesn't really have ways to deal with Face Aegis. Then we have Reinforcements. That's a bit more experimental, since we can't really play counters in a Justice market. I mean, there's Island's Choice and the 4-cost thing that draws a card, but they're pretty clunky, they're not very good. And this is more proactive and just kind of like locks certain decks out of playing most of their things that matter to us for 3 turns, which is pretty powerful. So against a control deck like Winchest, Yennev, or Hooru Control, if they don't have a Face Aegis, this can be a very powerful card that just makes sure you can kind of cement the status quo that you have and just ride the game to victory before they can play their meaningful cards anymore again, which is pretty nice in theory, but I haven't tested this too much, so it's something that I could see not panning out well enough or being worthwhile enough, and could be cut for other options. And then we have the Force Palace to have virtually 7 palaces. So yeah, this is the deck list. Congrats to Tobbo, making it through the ETS and taking down the whole thing with the list. I actually was kind of skeptical about the list and the deck in general beforehand, because it just felt a bit too fair and a bit too clunky for what other people are doing. But Tobbo proved that a Hooru mid-range deck of this kind has what it takes to compete at the top and deserves to be a top deck still or again right now. And yeah, so there you have the breakdown of the list and why it looks the way it looks. And yeah, let me know in the comments what you guys think about the deck if you have any questions. And as usual, gonna hop into some games with it to show it in action, show you how it plays out and how to pilot it. So yeah, see you in a moment with the first game. Stay tuned.